Dr. Deborah Sword. For decades, I've been a conflict specialist as a professor, trainer, practitioner, conflict coach. I'm going to share my research and experience in short podcasts based on the book I'm writing called Conflict Owner's Manual. I'm here with my co-host and friend, Tyson Bankert.
Hi everyone, my name is Tyson. My pronouns are he, him. I'm an artist and community facilitator here.
Conflicts generally aren't very pleasant. I know,
No.
Tyson, you and I have talked about this, but we should say one thing about conflict that's helpful. And that's through conflicts we learn and grow and develop. I compare it to the story of Thor's hammer that was forged in the heart of a star. We're made stronger in the heart of conflict. To be clear, we mean interpersonal conflict, not, for example, bullying or abuse. Those are crimes more than conflicts. They need different approaches.
Mm.
So, Tyson, how about you and I talk about the one reason that people aren't happy with how they do conflict?
Yeah, I think about this, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger kind of adage, right? And I think we can sometimes apply that to conflict because the reality is conflict does happen. And I think about how it has evolved in my own life has actually made me feel more resilient and more responsive. But I've also taken time to really look at my past experiences responding to conflict, and how I responded to conflict are usually future indicators of behavior. I think they've really become patterns. I find myself in different conflict patterns based on the relationships I hold and the ones I have with others. I find myself better at conflict with people I care actually less about, which is interesting. And I think about the kinds of conflict that I have with people that I have deep relationships with are actually a lot harder, I find. The patterns I find I get really stuck into. And think it's a desire to be really respected and well liked is often the founding piece of how I navigate conflict. I can feel more confident at responding to conflict with those I have a less stake with, a less emotional stake with interpersonally. And I have my patterns that I fall into, desire to be understood, maybe get a bit defensive, sometimes a little bit manipulative. I have my preferred modes, and I get really good at those over time. And so the more time I have, but I will find though, I do find that the more time I have time to reflect how to respond to conflict, think logically, and have perspective, I tend to react better, especially with those that I have deep relationships with, the ones that I really want to take care of.
Well, and that makes sense because the people who know us best, we care most about, they know our triggers as well.
Mm.
But talking about patterns is really important. It takes more effort to break a pattern than it does to fall into a pattern. Conflict patterns are a favorite conflict strategy. That's a go-to, your default, your happy place. For example, as soon as you think that someone criticizes you, your pattern might be to automatically attack or automatically avoid that person, or you right away criticize them back. That preference to avoid or attack then gets stronger. It becomes your preference, your happy place. And any other choices you have get less practice. They aren't as strong. But the important point is you have choices. Are you making those choices or are you just defaulting to your happy place?
Yeah, I think about, the adage of, you know, uh, flight, freeze, run kind of, idea. And I think we sometimes often can choose one and get really good at that. That conflict preference that you mentioned is really, yeah, becomes part of that pattern. And I think one way that I've been able to, and I think some folks here can recognize their conflict patterns, is you can also identify how satisfied you are with that pattern. Does it actually serve you? If your pattern is to avoid, then every time you see that person you're avoiding, you may feel bad, which isn't always a satisfying pattern. I think like does that pattern make us feel good, and do we want to continue to do that?
Well, human brains work in patterns and they get into a cycle. Our brains are pattern making machines.
Hmm.
So you have a triggering event and it brings up stress, fear of failure, engage the reflexes, shut down the higher level thinking. You can't
Mm.
think clearly. You get anxiety, stress, fear of failure.
Yikes.
Repeat. Conflict thrives in this pattern. If you have ever tried to break a habit, smokers will tell you this. Once you're in a conflict habit, it's hard to get out of it. So here are some ways to think about your conflict so you feel better about how you handle yourself. You understand the patterns. What
Mm.
do you usually do that doesn't help? What do you usually do that can help? Practice the patterns that improve your conflicts. What helpful patterns can you do more of? Change the patterns that don't improve your conflicts. And we're looking for tweaks because big changes are even harder. So, what tweaks can you do to your usual action so you feel better about how you handle conflict?
Ways, I think about what it might mean to have a short period of time to actually begin to think about, is this the pattern that I want to keep creating? Maybe it is going for a walk. Maybe it is taking some space to actually reflect a little bit more on, is this the pattern that I want to continue to create? How am I what's sort of my common pattern, and how do I break out of that cycle? Let's say your pattern is to cycle through the same conflict every time. One tip is to really identify what you think you want is indeed your really desired outcome. Is this pattern working for me?
That's a really good insight, Tyson, is am I meeting a short-term or a long-term goal? If my short-term goal is just to get the person to stop talking, to
Mm.
back off, am I playing into something that just keeps that system going so that the next time I see that person, it's going to be a repeat? Or am I
Mhm.
actually dealing with the real problem? And what's my goal? Is my goal just to get rid of the person, or is my goal to improve how I handle conflict? So that's a really good first step is to understand yourself and what you most want and need. And there's a difference between wanting and needing. And when you think about it, isn't self awareness a good thing, even if you aren't in a conflict? The key
Yeah.
point is this: patterns are habits, habits can be changed, and it's not easy. But you will feel better about yourself, even if you start to understand the pattern you're in.
Mm. And I think a real important theme too is to be curious about what kind of practice that you have when it comes to conflict. Um, I think is there someone who does conflict really well in your life, who feels like they're kind of conflict competent? I think, what does that person do that you would like to have as your preference? So identifying people in your life that you respond well to in conflict, I think, is also really important. What makes that the kind of um, conflict pattern that actually helps? Because conflict isn't bad. It's just, what kind of patterns do we have that we are able to hold that conflict?
I agree with you that conflict isn't necessarily bad, as long as you learn from it. So
Mm-hmm.
here's a fun exercise to try. Pick your favorite character on TV, in a book, or a movie. How does that person deal with conflict? We know that scripts need conflict to be interesting. So your character will get into conflict. Make a list of what that person does that's the same as what you do or different than what you do. And what is their conflict pattern? Is that helping you see what your conflict pattern is? And how effective is that pattern for your character and for yourself? What small change can you make that would make a big difference? It can be as small as, for example, thinking about your tone of voice before you
Mm-hmm.
speak.
Yeah. I'm looking forward to kind of digging a little bit deeper next time. We'll be back every week. So please join us again and tell your friends that we're discussing how to do conflict better, because you never know when you might be called upon to be conflict competent.
We all need to own our conflicts. So that's what the Conflict Owners Manual podcast will show you. Thanks for listening, and we hope you'll subscribe to our podcast.